In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how I made snake scales in Blender. This tutorial was requested by Filmorama Studio. The keys I'm using are in the bottom right corner of the viewport. I'll be using the default cube, scaling it to the size of 1 scale. I apply the scale using Ctrl A. In edit mode, I add 1 vertical and 1 horizontal loop cut. Using Alt-Z, I go into X-ray mode. I select the top corner vertices and scale them inward along the x-axis. And move the center vertices up along the y-axis. And then move the bottom vertices until I have a shape similar to a leaf. I add a subdivision surface modifier with a viewport level of 2 and make any necessary adjustments. I make a duplicate and move it along the x-axis so the 2 scales are touching. In object mode, I select the scales and set the origin to geometry to origin. In edit mode, I duplicate the scales and offset them from the original scales, making sure they overlap. In side view, I move the duplicated scales up along the z-axis. I then select all the scales and rotate them around the x-axis. In object mode, I select the scales and set the origin to geometry to origin. I also right-click and choose Shade Smooth. I add an array modifier above the subdivision surface modifier. I change the count and the X offset. And apply the modifier. I select the scales and set the origin to geometry to origin. I add a second cube that will be the bottom scales of the snake. I scale the cube to the same height along the z-axis. I also scale it along the y-axis to just slightly smaller than the scales. I scale it along the x-axis about 80% of the scale length. I apply the scale and move the bottom scale to the left so they are overlapping the first two scales. In edit mode, I add a vertical and horizontal loop cut. I enter X-ray mode and add a subdivision surface modifier with a viewport level of 2. I select the top center vertices and move them along the y-axis. I then select each of the 4 corners and move them inward along the x-axis. I select the top vertices and move them to align with the top of the scales. I then repeat this process for the bottom vertices. I also rotate it around the x-axis to match the original scales. In object mode, I join the 2 different scales using Ctrl-J. I select the scales and set the origin to geometry to origin. I add a Bezier circle, rotate it around the x-axis 90 degrees, and scale it up. I select the scales and add a curve modifier with the curve object being the Bezier circle. I then scale the Bezier circle until I connect the bottom scale to the top scales. I add a Bezier curve and move it along the y-axis. In edit mode, I subdivide, scale, rotate, and move the points of the curve to form the body of the snake. In object mode, I select the Bezier curve and use Shift S to move the curve back to the world origin. I select the scales and add a second curve modifier. This time using the Bezier curve as the curve object. I also changed the deform axis to -y so the scales are positioned correctly along the curve. Add a second array modifier between the 2 curve modifiers. I can now use the y offset and the count to complete the body of the snake. I select the Bezier curve and tab into edit mode. I can use Alt-S on the various vertices and scale them. I can now add some materials to the scales. I split the viewport and open the shader editor. For the base color, I will use a dark green color with a lower roughness and specularity. In edit mode, I can select the bottom scale using L for linked. I now add a second material with a yellow color and higher roughness and assign it to the selected faces. If you have a request for a tutorial, a question, or a comment, feel free to leave a comment below the video. If you're interested in learning more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.